Um, Hi everyone, and thank you for joining. I'm Sam Evans. I'm Business Development Manager for Climate Essentials, and thank you for joining us on this very rainy summer's day in Northern Ireland. Um, Climate Essentials have teamed up with Manufacturer and I to talk to you today about why manufacturers should care about carbon accounting. Just a little bit of housekeeping. We can go to housekeeping rules. Session will be recorded and shared afterwards. Please turn off your microphones during the presentation. If you have any questions during the presentation, pop them into the chat and Stephen will read them out later on. Questions and answer session is feel free to turn your camera on and microphone on and ask questions live if you wish. Today we're going to hear from Stephen Kelly, Chief Executive of Manufacturer and I, Martina Coleman, Head of Climate Science with those Climate Essentials, and obviously me, you already heard from. Today, this webinar is going to explore a couple of things: policy and regulation, the drivers, the practical steps, what does carbon footprint look like, and how to communicate your progress on carbon footprint. So that's enough from me because I've got a bad cold in the summer's day, and I'm going to hand over to the ever charismatic Stephen Kelly from Manufacturer and I. Cheers, Stephen.
Thanks, Sam. And like you, I have a cold as well, day one. So we're all sharing an experience here. I just wanted to set a bit of context for this webinar today. And it's really about that issue about decarbonisation and how quite quickly it has become the cost of entry to do business in Northern Ireland, in the UK, and globally. Next slide, please. So essentially what we're witnessing now is competing pressures of three directions. And in the middle of those pressures are our manufacturing businesses. So the first is the actual demands of consumers themselves. Consumers are much more demanding when it comes to how businesses actually operate. So they're no longer content, particularly younger consumers, no longer content that the world begins and continues to heat up. So they're making demands of the people who provide them with goods and with services, and they're making demands and choosing to purchase items that meet their own particular needs and demands that they have. The second pressure is that global and local policy position that we find ourselves in. So the world has set targets in terms of decarbonisation, but that's actually filtered down into UK national policy and indeed in terms of Northern Ireland regional policy. So we have our Climate Change Act from 2022, I believe it was, maybe 21, in Northern Ireland, and that sets mandatory reporting responsibilities for businesses, particularly businesses of half a billion pounds or more. But also it sets targets, not just for our manufacturing community, but elsewhere in the economy in terms of reducing emissions, setting targets for 2030 and for 2050. So aligned with that kind of consumer demand that's coming through, policymakers in the UK and in Northern Ireland are actually setting mandatory targets for particular sectors in terms of decarbonisation. And then the last piece is the responsibility from our customers has been passed back to suppliers. And if we give a practical example of that, we met with one of the biggest banks in Northern Ireland. We talked with their business and corporate team. In the room was their sustainability manager, and I asked, well, why is that person here? And they explained that because of the bank has a mandatory reporting responsibility because of its turnover size, that the bank were working with its top 50 customers in that year to take them through their decarbonisation agenda. In addition to that, they said that this current year, they're going to be working with their top 250 accounts and that they were working with their decarbonisation plans with those accounts. And I asked them, well, why were they doing that? And they were saying, well, as a bank, we have a bit of a high street footprint. We have some staff largely now working from home, some people on the road, and they print some some notes which are circulating in the economy. But outside of that, they don't have very much control over their own decarbonisation agenda. They don't have very much control over their own carbon. So for them, actually, their customers were their biggest problem. And I asked them, well, if that's the case, if the bank is working with these 250 customers, what happens when you get down into the smaller businesses and that the smaller businesses haven't responded to their needs? And quite clearly, they said that as a bank, they will have to debank some of those customers because the customers will be adding to the bank's own carbon reporting. And as a result, the bank would have to remove them as part of their customer base. So if you think about business as everything that you do is irrelevant in terms of supply chain, what you do in terms of your workforce, what you're doing in terms of your production facilities, all of that's irrelevant, and you're not actually in business until the moment that the check clears your account. Everything else is incidental until you actually get the money into your own hands. And if the means to actually get that money into your own hands is your banking facilities, and the risk here is that the bank will no longer be able to provide you with a service, then the bank and your problem and the bank's problem suddenly becomes your problem, sorry. So these are demands that are inescapable for many businesses. We've seen that those combining pressures of policy, demands from consumers, and that responsibility being passed on to you as suppliers is coming together, and quite quickly, this decarbonisation agenda is the cost of entry into business. Next slide, please. But in addition to that, we do have our Northern Ireland Assembly back. Our economy minister has made clear that he has four priorities, four pillars to the work that he's planning to achieve over his almost 3 years in office. He talks about good jobs that are regionally dispersed, and there's two massive big green ticks there for our manufacturing community. We're providing really good jobs in places right across Northern Ireland, in every town, village and townland across Northern Ireland. Our manufacturers are providing those good jobs. So we, by just being in business, we're already halfway through in terms of his demands and in terms of his vision for what the Northern Ireland economy will be. And then the other two is about driving productivity, and more particularly about decarbonised sectors. So our economy minister is making it clear that the functions that he has and the ability that he has to influence what our economy looks like will be delivered through the policies that his department are implementing, but in particular through the actions of agencies such as Invest NI. So unless our businesses are able to demonstrate that they're providing good, regionally dispersed, productive jobs that are decarbonising, then it's unlikely that agencies such as Invest NI and that the policy environment that's being set will not suit your business. So in addition to those demands that are coming, those three competing demands that I mentioned earlier, we also have the people who are there to support and provide you with a business environment for you to succeed will be setting the agenda in terms of what support they're able to provide. Next slide, please. So those are essentially existential issues that businesses need to get to grips with. And in many ways, our really good manufacturers are actually seeing this as an opportunity and not just simply that defensive play. They're working hard to ensure that they get out ahead of their competition and providing solutions for their customers and ultimately for the consumers of their products. And again, I'll give you an example in this area. So we've one manufacturing business who's involved in construction materials. They went and developed out a plan with an economic advisory agency. That plan was presented to the business, sat on a shelf for a number of months. But then out of the blue, their customer, which one of the big UK retailers, said, just like the bank I mentioned earlier, we have a big decarbonisation problem. We have a bit of a footprint on the high street, and we have some staff that are coming to and from our businesses. But outside of that, we don't have much influence over our own decarbonisation problem. That problem is now your problem, our suppliers, our manufacturers here in Northern Ireland. So they invited all their supply chain all the people who are providing materials for that retail business, to send them their decarbonisation plan. Now, luckily, the business here in Northern Ireland had that plan. They were able to send that plan directly across to the retailer, and the retailer maintained them on their supplier list. But the 5 other competitors that local business had didn't even begin the journey. So they were instantly delisted from that retailer. Now, in that period in time, that manufacturing business picked up market share. It was the only product that was available, and consumers really enjoyed it and have chosen to continue with them. So despite the fact that the local manufacturers' competitors hadn't got a plan in place, they caught up really quickly, or as quickly as they possibly could, got listed once again by the retailer. But in that moment where they were the only customer, the only supplier to that retailer, the local manufacturer picked up a significant amount of market share and have managed to maintain that. So people are seeing that these are opportunities for them whenever they get started. They're able to go to their customers and say, you have a problem, we can solve this problem for you. This is our plan. Please ensure that we get more of your business. And that's providing opportunities, not just in construction materials, but across a raft of other manufacturing areas. Next slide, please.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Stephen, for that amazing introduction. And thank you, everyone, for joining today. My name is Martina Coleman, and I'm head of climate science at Climate Essentials. I'm a chemical engineer by education, but I've been working in climate mitigation for the past 12 years now. 5 of those on Climate Essentials, where we provide carbon accounting software solutions for organizations to manage, track, and reduce their carbon emissions. So in a very chemical engineering fashion, I thought it would be great to start with a few numbers on how the manufacturing sector is contributing towards the carbon emissions from the UK. And we can see here that since 1990, the emissions from the manufacturing sector have been decreased steadily up until 2022, where it has become quite steady. On this y-axis, you can see how many tons of carbon emissions the manufacturing sector has been producing on a yearly basis. And then on the right-hand side, I have also plotted the contribution from the manufacturing sectors to the total UK emissions. The manufacturing sector has been done a lot when it comes to decarbonizing, with a 53% reduction since 1990. And this was mainly driven because of the decarbonization of the grid, and then the switch from coal to natural gas. Then when we look at 2022, the manufacturing sector has contributed 16% to the total UK carbon emissions. And the lowest point was in 2012, where they only contributed 13%. So we can see that as an industry, the manufacturing sector is decarbonizing and contributing towards the UK net zero by 2050. As Stephen mentions, there has been a lot of global targets, national targets that are going to trickle down and affect first organizations like public and private large organizations who they need to start tracking, reporting, and reducing their carbon emissions. We have global targets like the Paris Agreement. Then we have national targets in the UK. And those are going to trickle down to the sector, like the electricity mix, for example, to smaller organizations, where these smaller organizations can then affect the portfolios and the assets that they manage. Everything that is happening and all the decarbonization that smaller organizations are doing are going to trickle up and contribute to the targets that we have at a sectoral level, at a national level, and at a global level. All of these legislation frameworks that are going to affect larger organizations and public organizations are going to trickle down, and these organizations may be asked of you to start measuring, tracking, and reporting your carbon emissions. Just to give you a few practical examples, here I have highlighted 3 frameworks and regulations that are already up and are affecting large organizations. The first one is coming from the public sector, from the central government, and it's PPN 6/21 and 1/24, which is only 2 months old. This policy procurement note states that if you're looking to engage and provide a product or a service to the central government, and that contract value is over £5 million, but it can be lower in some cases, then the central government is going to ask you, as part of the tender requirements, to measure your scope 1, your scope 2, and some categories of scope 3 emissions. And I'm going to explain what those means later in a few minutes. Another piece of legislation that is currently present in the UK, it's called Streamlined Energy Carbon Reporting. And this is tackling large organizations who use a lot of energy. On a yearly basis, as part of their financial accounts, they also need to report on the carbon emissions coming from the energy that they use. So that is going to be scope 1 and scope 2 emissions that they need to report on a yearly basis when they submit their financial accounts. And another one, which is big and is going to affect many companies in the next few years, is coming from the EU, and it's called Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. This sustainability reporting legislation is going to cover around 49,000 companies across the EU, for companies based on the EU first, and then companies that transact in the European market. This set of legislation and sustainability reporting requirements are asking these 49,000 companies to report on their carbon emissions, not only from their own operations, but also for their supply chain. So that means that even if you're not covered by this European policy just yet, but you're part of the supply chain of one of those companies that are covered by CSRD, this means that these companies may be asked for their suppliers, so that's you, to report on your carbon footprint and create a reduction plan. Just to give you another example, similar as what Stephen mentioned, we have a manufacturing of food products using Climate Essentials for quite a few years now. They are small, they have around 50 employees, 2 manufacturing sites in the UK. They are not covered by any legislation just yet, but they are a supplier to Tesco. Tesco has made a net zero commitment, not only for themselves, but also for the supply chain. So in April 2022, this food manufacturing company received an email from Tesco asking them to provide a carbon footprint and a carbon reduction plan for their operations. If they fail to do that by December 2023, then Tesco may not be buying from them anymore. So we can see how these legislations, which are now covering large organizations, are going to trickle down, and they may affect your organization, which may be a small business, but you're part of a supply chain of a large organization who is covered by these pieces of legislation. Similarly to what Stephen mentioned, in 2023, in December, we actually asked many of our clients what were the major drivers that prompt them to start thinking about measuring their carbon emissions and create a reduction plan. The top 5 drivers were related to internal, because they knew it was the right thing to do, and it was part of the core value of their business. They wanted to improve their brand image and differentiate themselves against competitors. But then the other 3 top drivers were related to external pressure. These were increased expectations from their clients. They were preparing their operations for upcoming regulation. And then they started thinking about carbon footprint and carbon reduction planning because it was a requirement from their buyers for tenders. So we can see whether carbon accounting is important from a value perspective, but it's also important for our clients because they are preparing for external pressure that may affect the way that they do business. So in a nutshell, what are the drivers for manufacturers to start thinking about carbon footprint, carbon reduction, and net zero strategies? From one side, we have the perspective of value creation. How can carbon footprint and carbon reduction and thinking of a strategy can help your organization creating value? On one side, we have operational efficiencies. When you start measuring the carbon emissions and start thinking of ways in which you can reduce the contribution to climate change from your organizations, you may be discovering new ways that you can enhance recycling. You can think of ways in which you can make the transportation of the products more efficient, for example, or transition to lower carbon vehicles, for example. And then you can start looking at the way that you use your energy in the buildings that you operate. As many of our clients, a huge drivers for manufacturers is brand differentiation. By taking a stand on how you are committed to tackle climate change, this may help you gain a competitive advantage against similar businesses that operate within your sector. And then by looking at your operations from a carbon accounting perspective, it may help you access new markets, new products. It may help you apply for tenders and tackle consumer preferences as well. Another driver for manufacturers to start thinking about carbon accounting is value protection. As many of our clients, they know that carbon accounting and carbon legislation is coming, so they need to prepare for upcoming regulation. Stephen mentioned that employees, especially the younger generation, are quite involved when it comes to sustainability matters. So by proving to your workforce that you're tackling climate change and you have a plan on how you're planning on reducing your carbon emissions, it may help you retain your employees and foster a low carbon work environment. And lastly, by going through the process of carbon accounting, you are maybe able to discover ways in which you can substitute resources, you can diversify your products, and then by creating a reduction strategy and thinking of ways in which you can reduce energy emissions, it may help you participate in renewable energy markets as well, and inject some electricity into the grid if you're planning on doing renewable energy on-site generation. We have highlighted here a few ways in which you can see that carbon mitigation may help you discover some cost savings opportunity when it comes to energy. I think a couple of months ago, there was an amazing report that was presented at COP that highlighted that 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions could be reduced by implementing new energy systems, renewable energy, and energy efficiency. On this chart here, you can see different ways in which an organization can reduce their energy usage and the energy-related carbon emissions. And then color-coded, it's the cost associated with implementing these actions. You can see that some of the ways in which you can reduce your energy emissions are related to renewable energy. And those mitigation options are actually quite cheap, and it's not going to cost you money in the long run, but it may help you save money. There are other things that are relatively cheap, and they cost less than $20 per ton of carbon dioxide that you want to reduce. But then we can see some mitigation options that are still quite expensive, like carbon capture and storage. There has been a lot of information and debate about the role of carbon capture and storage when it comes to reducing carbon emissions. But at the moment, these technologies are not readily available for everyone. And even when you can implement carbon capture and storage in your business, it may cost you a lot of money. And there are at the moment cheaper options in which you can reduce your energy-related carbon emissions. So how do you actually start thinking about measuring your carbon emissions and creating a reduction plan? There is a lot of information out there, and we know that if you have never done any carbon accounting process, it may feel a bit daunting in the type of information that you can find online. Whether you choose to do your carbon footprint reduction plan yourself within your ranks, whether you choose a consultant, or whether you choose a carbon accounting software solution, you should make sure that whatever solution you implement for your organization, the methodology that is going to be used to measure your carbon footprint should follow the guidelines of the Greenhouse Gas Protocol. The Greenhouse Gas Protocol is the most well-renowned framework when it comes to carbon accounting, and all organizations should use this framework to measure and report their carbon emissions. It is an extremely long document. If we take into account the three major documents for the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, I think this is around 400 pages long. And you're more than welcome to read all of that if you're very extremely interested and passionate about carbon accounting. But if you're not if you don't want to read that, just make sure that whatever solution you choose for your carbon accounting, it's completely aligned with the greenhouse gas protocol. This protocol, and I'm sure you have heard about this before, states that organizations along their carbon footprint measurement, they should report their carbon emissions into three different scopes, which are called Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions. So what are those Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3 emissions? Scope 1 emissions are, in the simplest way, is the energy that you're using and the fuel that you're burning. So if you have a gas boiler in your offices, the gas usage is going to fall into Scope 1 emissions. Similarly, if you're using heating oil or if you have a diesel generator, then all those fossil fuels that you are burning in your premises or in things that you own or control are going to fall within Scope 1 emissions. If you own any passenger or delivery vehicles like a diesel van or a petrol car, all those fuels that you're using in your vehicles are also going to fall into Scope 1. And then one little source that most organizations fail to report, but in some cases is actually quite a big contributor of Scope 1 emissions, is refrigerant leakage. We have a manufacturing business using Climate Essentials, and they produce food products as well. And they have huge refrigeration units in their manufacturing sites. And they need to top up the refrigerant on their yearly engineering maintenance of those refrigeration units on a yearly basis. Refrigerants are actually quite powerful greenhouse gases. So that leaks that happens on a yearly basis whenever you need to top up the refrigerant actually falls within Scope 1 emissions. And it may be, in some cases, a big source of Scope 1 emissions. Scope 1 emissions are the emissions that you're directly responsible for. So make sure that if you have any big refrigeration units within your premises, make sure that you also account for refrigerant leakage as well. Scope 2 emissions are usually referred to indirect emissions. And the easiest way to explain it is Scope 2 emissions is the energy that you're using that is being generated by someone else. It's a completely fail of the first law of thermodynamics. But basically, the easiest example is the electricity that you use in your buildings. You probably are not generating the electricity yourself. You're buying it from your electricity provider. So this is energy that you're using that is being generated by someone else. Another example of Scope 2 emissions is district heating for some places in the UK. Or if we talk about manufacturing businesses, the steam that you're buying, if you are located in an industrial site, for example, that is going to fall within Scope 2 emissions. And they are usually referred to as indirect emissions, but you still have some control on how you tackle Scope 2 emissions and how to create a reduction plan to reduce them. Then it comes to Scope 3, which is called the Wild West of carbon accounting. I attended a meeting a few years ago where the Chief Sustainability Officer of Microsoft was talking about Scope 3. And he coined the term Wild West of carbon accounting, and I have shamelessly stolen it ever since. Scope 3 emission is everything that is happening across your value chain. So from the products and services that you're buying, to the waste that you generate, to how your clients use and dispose of the products that you manufacture, everything that is not related to energy usage is going to fall within Scope 3. Within Scope 3, there are two major categories, which is upstream and downstream. And I have highlighted for you which are the biggest contributors to Scope 3 emissions when it comes to a survey done by surveying 35,000 companies. You can see all these categories here, like business travels, employee commuting, waste, downstream assets, use of sold products. It's a lot of categories that fall within Scope 3. So it is not surprising when I say that usually between 75 to 95% of the carbon emissions of any business is going to fall within Scope 3. I have highlighted here, and you're going to see these orange blurbs across the webinar, some numbers and some little nuggets of information that may be relevant for manufacturing businesses. So on average, for manufacturing businesses, scope 3 is nearly 8 times higher than your scope 1 and your scope 2. So you can see how scope 3 emissions may be an important part of your carbon footprint, and you may need to start measuring at some point. So how do you actually tackle your carbon accounting process, and where do you start? You have here about scope 1, scope 2 emissions, 15 categories of scope 3. So it may be a bit daunting to know where you actually start with your carbon accounting process. So a good approach that you can start having a look at is what the net zero frameworks are actually asking organizations to report on. So here I have highlighted 4 net zero frameworks and what are they requiring organizations to measure. So if we start at the bottom, you may have heard of Science-Based Target Initiative. The Science-Based Target Initiative is a framework that validates the net zero target of organizations. If you are a manufacturing business with fewer than 250 employees, and you want to set an interim reduction target by 2030, then the Science-Based Target Initiative is going to ask you to measure your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions, and then reduce it by half, around half, by 2030. So if you want to set an interim reduction target using the Science-Based Target Initiative, you can start by measuring your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions. Another similar framework to validate your net zero target, it's called the SME Climate Hub. And again, if you want to set an interim reduction target by 2030, then the SME Climate Hub is going to ask you to measure your scope 1 emissions, your scope 2 emissions, and your business travel related emissions, which fall within scope 3. Another option is looking at the UK frameworks and legislation. Before I mentioned PPN 6/21, which is for organizations who are tendering for a contract with the central government to provide a product and a service. If you want to align your carbon accounting and your reduction pathway with PPN 6/21, in addition to measuring your scope 1 emissions, your scope 2 emissions, and your business travel emissions, you will be required to measure also your employee commuting emissions, your upstream transportation, and the waste that you generate. If you're a bit more advanced in your carbon accounting process and you want to set a net zero target by 2050 in alignment with the UK net zero target by 2050, whether you choose the Science-Based Target or the SME Climate Hub or any other net zero validation frameworks, then in that case, you're not going to have to measure only scope 1 and scope 2, but you're also going to have to measure all relevant categories within scope 3. So that is a great way where you can start thinking about which categories may be relevant for your business. Look at the framework that you want to align your net zero target with and see what this framework is asking you to measure. Another way in which you can think about starting your carbon accounting process is to look at the sector in which you operate and see what their emission profile looks like. And here I put a few examples for different industries. So if you are in the steel industry, you can see that by tackling scope 1 and scope 2 emissions, you're probably going to have like 70% of your total carbon footprint measured. However, if you work in the electronics manufacturing sector, then you can see that scope 1 and scope 2 emissions only cover around 23% of the total footprint. So having a look at your scope 3 emissions may be a good way to have most of your carbon footprint measured. And just to give you a benchmarking, here in the UK, the average carbon footprint for a manufacturer of electronic items is around 1,000 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Here I put a few, another practical example on what does a carbon footprint look like for a chemical product business. Here we can see that for a business working in the chemical industry, scope 1, scope 2, and the products that they are buying are going to cover around 70% of their total carbon emissions. So if you need to start thinking about your carbon accounting processes, looking at these categories maybe help you cover the majority of your carbon emissions, and then you can move to the next categories that may be relevant for your organization. I chose the chemical industry because the chemical sector as a whole is responsible for an eighth of the global industrial carbon emissions, and 95% of the products that we use rely on some sort of chemicals. If you want to see how different chemical companies or any other company is doing when it comes to their climate commitments, their reduction strategies, their net zero targets, you can go to an organization called the CDP, and those organizations submitting their climate commitments under the CDP is going to have their information publicly available. So you can see how companies like AkzoNobel and Johnson have their climate commitments and are the best performing companies. And there are some other companies like Dow Chemical who are lagging a bit behind. And I hope no one from Dow Chemical is on the webinar by now. If so, I'm sorry. Then just another nugget of information, the average carbon footprint for manufacturers of chemical products in the UK is around 4,500 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, which is significantly higher than a manufacturer of electronic products. We always tell this to our clients of Climate Essentials. No one is expecting you to go from 0 to 100 in a couple of days. Carbon accounting is a journey. And as long as you're transparent on how you're getting along with that journey, then no one is going to tell you anything about the way that you're going about it, as long as you're transparent and you're following a framework. So this is how you can start with your accounting journey. First, think about the year that is most representative for your operations. And for that year that you choose as a baseline year, you can get a head start and try measure at least your scope 1 and your scope 2 emissions by getting, the energy data, your gas, your electricity bills. Once you have your scope 1 and your scope 2 in order, then you can start broadening the scope a little bit when it comes to measuring your carbon footprint. You can start surveying your employees, trying to measure the home working emissions, the employee commuting, homework, business travels. And then from data from your financial systems, then you can even broaden the scope a little bit more for your carbon footprint, like looking at the products that you're buying. Once you have your baseline year, then you can start creating a tracking strategy. And I'm going to give you a few tips on how to create carbon KPIs to track your progress. You can always report your baseline internally for your employees and stakeholders, but you can also be extremely transparent and publish those results externally for your clients, for example. We always recommend that you collaborate with your employees and your team. No one knows your company better than your employees, so try to engage with them and try to ask them ideas and workshop ways in which you can lower your carbon emissions from your organization. And once you have highlighted ways in which you can reduce your carbon footprint, I would encourage any organization to start thinking about writing a climate or a carbon reduction strategy, track their carbon emissions over time. And once you have seen your carbon footprint progress for a couple of years, and you have clearly specified the actions that you want to take to reduce carbon emissions, you can set a net zero target and get it validated via Science-Based Target Initiative, for example, or the SME Climate Hub. After you have gone through those processes, then you need to start implementing the reduction plan that you created, track your KPIs, measure your carbon footprint on a yearly basis, and most importantly, communicate the progress, both internally for your employees, and if you want externally for your customers as well. I mentioned briefly about communicating your progress. Usually, alongside the carbon footprint of your operation, is always best practice to establish a carbon KPI. So those can, depending on the sector in which you operate, You can choose a carbon KPI like emissions per full-time equivalent if your company is growing, for example, emissions per pound of sales, emissions per sold products, or emissions per square footage if you're thinking of acquiring new manufacturing sites. Just to give you a few examples on how to communicate your carbon KPIs, here I have added the average carbon footprint for a manufacturer of plastic products, the average carbon footprint by employee for those manufacturers of plastic products, and the average carbon footprint per million pound of sales. So depends on the business sector in which you are operating, you may choose to track one or more than one KPI. And once you have established your KPIs and you have a way of tracking your carbon footprint, then the next best thing that you can do is communicate how you're getting along with your carbon footprint measurement. Here we have added a few tips on how to communicate your progress. And I've mentioned this a couple of times across the webinar. You always have to be transparent in the way that you have chosen your baseline year, in the methodology that you're using to report your carbon emissions, the assumptions that you have made. If there are any data gaps in your carbon accounting process, there's always going to be some data gaps, especially if it's the first time in which you are making your carbon accounting process. So this transparent process is going to help you build trust with your stakeholders. You should also welcome problem solving from different stakeholders and from your employees as well. And always, when you are transparent in your carbon accounting process, be transparent about any challenges and restrictions as well. When it comes from a greenwashing perspective, once you have your carbon baseline in place, you should try to avoid words like greener, eco-friendly, more sustainable than, and try to stick to quantitative facts about your carbon footprint and your reduction strategy. Whether you choose a consultant, you do your carbon accounting in place, or you choose a software solution like Climate Essentials, make sure that whatever solution you use, you are clear and you provide resources. So for example, for any Climate Essentials user, we have a net zero community where we provide communication guidelines and carbon reporting best practices. So make sure that you have all the information that you need in place to be transparent about your carbon footprint. Another top tip to communicate your progress is to be clear about the opportunities that carbon accounting arise for your business. Track your carbon emissions, be transparent on any increases. No one expects your carbon emissions to go down on a perfect line. If you're a growing organization, or if there is 1 year in which you have bought a lot of machinery, for example, we expect the carbon footprint to go up. But be clear about any wins that you have achieved through your carbon accounting and reduction process, manage expectations from your stakeholders, and most importantly, have a direction of travel. By tracking your carbon footprint and quantifying your reduction strategy, you may be able to clearly state where you want to be and how you're going to get there. And then last tip from ourselves is always share your progress and share ownership. Be transparent on the values of your companies when it comes to climate mitigation, how you're going to help your organization or the UK get to net zero by 2050. Share responsibility within your workforce, set a sustainability team that may help you track your progress, and then continue the buy-in within your organization. And then the last thing from me, it's one slide on how to avoid greenwashing. And this is for organizations who have already started measuring their carbon emissions. They have started making some progress. They have a climate strategy in place. And maybe you're thinking about setting a net zero target. It is always best practice to make sure that any claims that you're doing is clear and is unambiguous. Is the statement that you're taking when it comes to carbon reduction representative of your whole operations? Is it the whole picture, or are you just talking about a certain department or a certain geography within your processes? And most importantly, is the claim that you're making when it comes to your carbon reduction plan or your net zero strategy is backed by evidence, is backed by quantitative data, and can this claim be verified by anyone that looks at your business from an external perspective? So once you are ready to publicly disclose your carbon footprint and your reduction strategy, just make sure to go through these 4 questions to ensure that you are making a claim that is quantitative, is backed by science, and then you're going to be able to avoid being accused of greenwashing in the future. So I think that's it from our side. We have a couple of minutes for Q&A, but from my side and from everyone, thank you so much for attending today. And again, if you have any questions now, please drop them in the chat or unmute yourself. Or if you have any questions after the webinar, please do not hesitate to get in touch with us. Thank you.
Maybe then if I just kick off, Martina, thank you so much yourself and Sam for doing that. As is the case with anything new to the individual, this isn't new science or new demands, but it's for many people on the call and others watching later will be something new in their business that they need to begin to understand. What do you think? Should they be worried? Should they be concerned? Should they be thinking that they need to set up a whole new division within their business, etc., etc., etc.? Or are there easy ways to begin? And once people start getting hold of this issue, it begins to unwind a bit from there.
Yeah, I wouldn't say panic for now, just be informed of regulation that may be coming up. Try to keep track of things that may be happening on a climate perspective, carbon accounting perspective, so you can be prepared whenever, if and when, someone like your supplier or the government is going to be asking you to measure and report your carbon footprint and a reduction plan. I know that SMEs usually struggle for time, for resources. Climate change and carbon mitigation may not be on the top of their priority list, and that is completely fine. But you should think about climate mitigation and carbon accounting as an opportunity rather than a threat. And it's not, I mean, the first time that you do it may take a little bit of time, but it's just like, financial accounting. You just need to get the hold of it, trying to involve your employees, your workforce, your shareholders, so you can start having a carbon footprint and a carbon reduction in place. There is a lot of information outlined. The UK government is actually extremely good in providing all the carbon factors that you need to do your carbon reporting. So have a look at that. They also provide best practices on how you should report on your carbon emissions if you're an SME. So you don't need to panic and then go into a consultant that is going to charge you probably a lot of money. If you want to do that, that's completely fine. But know that there is a lot of information online that can help you. There is organizations like Manufacturing NI that are there to help you solve any issues. And try to think of it as a process and a way in which you can prepare your organizations to be more resilient in the future.
And on the back of that, so there's some questions that have started to come in there, and Sam's put a few in. Obviously, in the midst of something new, there's a lot of confusion. There's lots of people offering potential solutions, etc., etc., etc. And I mean, the reason why we're doing this with you guys is you have a simple entry system that provides lots of information out the other side, including comparisons with other businesses within your industry, so you can benchmark yourself. I mean, is there and it's affordable, which is one of the other reasons why we're talking to you, which is directly to the question that someone has asked here. What's the most affordable way to start? Most affordable way of starting your carbon account? Can people do this themselves? Obviously, your organization provide a platform, and there's others as well. But what's the most affordable way for people to begin?
Yeah, I think the most affordable way is to try to find official resources online from the UK government. As I said, they have amazing resources when it comes to carbon factors, to best practices. They also provide publicly available information on how the manufacturing sector is doing as a whole. So if you have the time and the resources to do it yourself, then a good way and best practice, I would say, is to always go to the official sources. Then if you are struggling for time, then another way would be to use carbon accounting solutions like Climate Essentials, they have incorporated all the methodology, the best practice, the UK official carbon factors into a software solution that can help you get to a result in a quicker way and in a way that is affordable, but also aligned with science. And then if you don't want to do it yourself, or you don't want to rely on carbon accounting solutions, you can always hire an external person to do all the carbon accounting for you, but that's probably not going to be cheap. So I would just suggest to start looking at official information online. And then if you choose to, you can always find a carbon accounting solution like ours.
So on the back of that then, so the first question we have is that, are you able to share a sample carbon reduction action plan? Do you provide that? So once people start to input and use your system and other systems that are available, obviously,
yes.
Do
Yes.
those partners provide those sample plans as well?
Yes, so our software solution, once we have the carbon footprint ready for you, we analyze the data and we can provide a carbon reduction plan of things that you can implement on your business to start reducing your carbon emissions. Obviously, if you're not using our solution, the UK carbon reduction template is a good resource that you can download. And that reduction template is aligned with the requirements of PPN. So you can have a look at those resources. And then if you're a user of Climate Essentials, you have access to our Net Zero community, which has all the templates that you need to go through your carbon accounting process.
And Sam, so before we leave the Climate Essentials platform itself, you're on the ground here in Northern Ireland. Martina's in the UK, obviously, but you're on the ground here in Northern Ireland. You see a lot of solutions out there, obviously, but what's the kind of price differential as a minimum? So the people are obviously concerned that this is going to cost them a lot of money. Should it cost them a lot of money?
Of course. Well, no, through Climate Essentials, we put our pricing at we don't want budget ever to be a barrier into doing the right thing. So we have set ourselves a price range where we can get everyone on the long tail of the supply chain involved. And our price, if I can be a blunt, cost from for a small business with one site on up to 10 people, it's only £120 per year for that full access to the platform, with including the carbon reduction plan, reporting mechanisms, and fantastic estimation tools. Obviously, it scales up a bit more with the bigger the business, but yes, we are a very affordable solution.
And there's a question here. I suppose I can maybe take this one. Are Invest NI and Manufacturing NI going to offer service for Scope 3 emissions? I mean, I do know that Invest NI are focusing on that decarbonisation agenda because the minister has set them that target. There are a number of projects that Invest NI are doing. There are a number of schemes that, excuse me, that they're offering to their client-facing or their client-led companies. Will Invest NI or others provide this type of work, grant supported for free for everyone? I very much doubt it. People will have to find their own way. We'll certainly play a role in terms of information sharing, etc., etc., etc. But I wouldn't expect Invest NI to reach out to all 85,000 companies in Northern Ireland who will have a responsibility around this area, and step in and provide them with that support. Martina, a question for you, because I did pick up on this as well as you were speaking, but you did recommend people avoid using the word sustainable or eco-friendly. And we have a question in here just on that. Why should people avoid those words?
Yes, so there has been lately some controversy, let's say, about the wording that you should use. And there is a new legislation from the EU for green claims for products. And then this EU directive, it recommends organizations to basically stop using words like carbon neutral, eco-friendly, more sustainable, because everything that you're claiming should be based on data that can be verified, numbers, quantitative information. So I can paste the legislation here, and you can see the type of wording that you should avoid. Because this carbon accounting sphere has been not regulated for many years. So now, for example, the EU is trying to make sure that we are avoiding greenwashing, and everything that you say when it comes to the products that you're manufacturing, the way that you run your organization should be backed with quantitative information. So instead of saying more eco-friendly, you should be able to say, these were our carbon emissions at this stage. This is the number for this year. This is a difference of X, Y%. So instead of using qualitative terminology, you should always refer to quantitative data.
Okay, thanks. Question here regarding regulations. What is the best way to stay informed to make sure we are preparing for the appropriate regulations? Is this something we just need to figure out for ourselves?
Yes, well, it depends of when you choose to, go through this on your own, or you have a partner, a consultant, or a carbon accounting solution. Carbon accounting solutions they should be having the platform updated with the latest regulation. I always try to refer to bodies like Manufacturing NI or Tech UK, for example. They have amazing team of people that keep track of any changes of upcoming regulation. They send you newsletters, they send you information of anything major that is happening, so you don't actually have to go and do the research yourself. There are bodies, there is organizations that do all the hard work, and they go through all those boring policies, and you get, a summarized version on a newsletter or on an email with the highlights of things that you should be aware about.
And this is a question that I've actually encountered myself, being a supplier in many respects to a manufacturing business in Northern Ireland. We were approached and asked to present them with a certificate so that they could add this into our members' own accounting. But is there a recommended certification for carbon offsetting or for carbon neutrality? What are people expected to present?
Yes, so carbon offsetting, it's a way in which organizations can balance their emissions by supporting an outside project that is taking carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. If you choose to go through measure your carbon emissions and then balancing your carbon emissions by buying carbon offsets, first, I would suggest that you go to suppliers of carbon offsets that have gone through a verification process. So I would recommend the United Nations carbon offset platform, the gold standard Verra, and they have a traceable system where every carbon offset that you buy, they have a serial number and they give you a certification. Those organizations have gone through a process to make sure that those carbon offsets were real, additional, verifiable, and measurable. So if you choose to go through buying the carbon credits route, make sure that you buy them from official providers and they're going to issue with a certificate of carbon dioxide removal. Having said that, carbon neutral is again another word that is causing a lot of controversy. So the wording that I would use if you choose to buy carbon credits to balance your emission would be not carbon neutral, but it would be supporting climate mitigation or supporting the transition to net zero or to decarbonization. But I wouldn't use the word carbon neutral anymore, and I have sent you a link on why you should avoid that. And then again, if you choose to do that, that's completely fine, but make sure that you are buying those carbon credits from official providers who are going to give you a certificate of removal. And then make sure you're using the right wording to mention that you are using carbon offsets as an interim way or as an additional way in addition to reducing your carbon emissions. I should also note that carbon offsets cannot be used to set a net zero target. So your net zero strategy should rely on decarbonization rather than carbon offsets.
And I mean, the challenge here is that this is for many such a new industry, and for regulators across the globe they're running to catch up. And in that space in between, there are people providing or suggesting that they have the solution for you. So you're basically saying, listen, regulation is either here or it's coming or it's on its way. You're best using official resources, official sources to do that, and don't get yourself down a rabbit hole that you end up having to extricate yourself from in many respects. And the question here, just in terms of, obviously businesses are operating multiple systems, from CRM systems to systems to run their factory, run their payroll, run their mileage, run whatever within businesses. Are there means to integrate some of this information with what businesses are already doing in terms of good productivity improvements, financials, etc., etc., etc.?
Yeah, I have seen a few solutions that incorporate carbon accounting with your financial accounting. That is a great way to get like a first estimation of, your carbon footprint, but then you realize that the only way that you can evidence any carbon reduction is by spending less money, which is counterintuitive. You need to decouple, economic growth from carbon emissions. So relying on financial accounting to do your carbon accounting sometimes has a few limits. So that is a first stage if you want to get like a quick estimation of your carbon footprint, but then it would be very difficult to evidence any progress when you connect with your financial accounting, for example. There are a few other solutions, I think, for large organizations from Microsoft. So if you're using Microsoft solutions, you can incorporate some of your data and transform that into carbon accounting. But I haven't seen a lot of organizations using that. And I think for best practice, sometimes it's better to have two systems, but I can understand why that may take a little bit more of your time, if that makes sense.
Sure. We've just gone over our hour by 1 minute. I'm going to wrap up here now. Sam, from your perspective, you're very helpfully inputted your contact details should people have any other questions post this meeting. What should people do today, tomorrow, to maybe not Friday because we're all off, but in the next 24, 48 hours?
Yeah, but if anyone wants to get in touch, if they've got further questions, they need advice or anything, there's no hard sell here. It's just about getting people on that journey, because it's vital that they do. And those who are doing it early enough are getting the gains from it, in effect, saving money and getting competitive advantage. So, yeah, if anyone wants to get in touch, to have a chat. I'm not a climate genius like Martina by